Deus, o salutaris nostre, Domine ex Deus, Kyrie ex Deus, Deus noster, Gallarate, Domine ex Deus, Angeli, Angeli, Ave Patete, Ladamon Deurem, Domino Maestatis,
Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Monday, June 2nd. It's the day after my birthday. My birthday was yesterday. I had a fantastic, awesome day. Just an awesome birthday. Got to go to the TLM yesterday. It was just a great birthday. So it was my birthday yesterday, but today we're back to work. And you may be wondering why today I'm doing a different stream than my normal Monday stream. I have a very consistent schedule. And usually on Mondays I do Q&A, but this Monday I'm not doing Q&A, and that's for a very particular reason. The reason is because I'm taking a bit of a vacation. So I will be leaving Thursday evening. I'll be out of the state. I will be away. I will not be online, and I'll be coming back Wednesday morning. So I will have no streams on Thursday evening. Thursday morning, afternoonish, I'll probably do a stream on Pope Leo. I might have something with the other Paul that day as well. I will be on Wednesday. I want to do something on the Sacred Heart because it's the month of the Sacred Heart, and I want to do the document of go over the document of Pope Francis on the Sacred Heart. Just to introduce you guys to the Sacred Heart if you don't know about it. And then tomorrow, I'm supposed to be having my much anticipated discussion with Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, about the Thomistic view of the Trinity. So I will be having a jam-packed week, and I just could not fit a Q&A in. A few people were asking when I'll do my next Q&A, when are you going to do a Q&A? Probably the day that I get back. So that Wednesday, I will probably not have, since I would have been on vacation, I will not have prepared anything ahead of time to present to you guys. So on that day, I will probably do a Q&A on Wednesday evening. So no Q&A this week, but you will be getting the Pope Leo stream this week, which I did not have the ability to do last week. So Pope Leo update will be on Thursday. So look out for all of that stuff. But tonight, I'm actually doing something I usually don't do. This will be a little bit me explaining things and doing a bit of a monologue. But it's also, alongside of that, it's a book review. So a few of you know, I've posted about it on Twitter. Pine Sap and I talked about it as well. There's recently a book that came out, Religious Liberty, Continuity or Contradiction. And this is about Dignitatis Humanae. For those who don't know, Dignitatis Humanae is the document at the Second Vatican Council, which is on religious liberty. And it's seen by many to be one of their biggest stumbling blocks towards either adherence to the Second Vatican Council as a Catholic or towards adherence to Catholicism in general, because they hear about religious liberty. They see that religious liberty was infallibly condemned under Gregory the 16th, Blessed Pius the 9th, and many other popes beside that. And then they see an ecumenical council, the Second Vatican Council, teaching religious liberty. So they have many confusions. Is religious liberty being used in the same sense? Is what is condemned by those popes what is confirmed by Vatican II, et cetera, et cetera. So what this book proposes to do is this book, it wants to go over and to solve the contradiction. And this isn't a full study. So that's what I kind of want to bring out in the beginning. So this is actually very apt for me to talk about this in a stream form, in a video form. It's actually quite a simple distinction that they make between the two. So it's very easy, very apt for explanation and being able to draw forth the conclusions. Actually, that's something that I can't remember which one of the reviewers said this. I think it might have been either Dr. Joy or no, it was Father Louis Marie de French name that I cannot pronounce. One of the best aspects to this solution to the problem of religious liberty is it's a relatively easy solution to understand. It's a very simple solution to understand. And as I mentioned, it doesn't go over all of the details surrounding religious liberty. It doesn't go over, much about the historical praxis of the church. It doesn't go over the state as arm of the church. It doesn't go over many of the different controversies around separation of church and state, deconfessionalization, and things like that. It doesn't go over all of those details. There's other works that go over those details. Actually, if you scroll all the way up in the live chat, I linked two of them. One of them is a classical text from Nicolau. Nicolau was one of the authors of the Sacrae Theologiae Summa. He was a Jesuit scholastic, and after the Second Vatican Council, he wrote a pretty famous defense and explanation of the history surrounding religious liberty, and shows how Dignitatis Humanae does not contradict the previous tradition. So I put other documents in the live chat if you want to look at those. But this one in particular I found to be helpful for solely the purpose of going over whether there's a contradiction or not, which is where a lot of people are. They might not be able to understand all of the different arguments that are given. They're maybe not able to understand how this affects other areas of doctrine, but they just want to know whether there is a contradiction or not in the document. So Father Lucian, for those who don't know who Father Lucian is, he's a very interesting figure because he was actually one of the seminarians at Icone under Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And for those who don't know Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, he was a very prominent figure in the church in the latter half of the 20th century. He was a very famous missionary in Africa, and then he was a council father at the Second Vatican Council. And eventually he got in some tensions with the hierarchy of the church, and eventually consecrated bishops without a papal mandate, which led to the declaration of his excommunication. But he was one of the seminarians under Archbishop Lefebvre, and during this period of hostility to the hierarchy of the church, he ended up becoming a sedevacantist, or more properly, what's called a sedeprivationist, but he didn't recognize the Pope, basically, which put him at odds with Archbishop Lefebvre. There were a group of seminarians that left, and eventually they grouped together into a religious society. And Father Lucian, he actually, one of his big points of research in which he produced academic works that were of value and widely quoted among the French, is he produced a work which went over the teaching of Gregory XVI, Blessed Pius IX, and Vatican II. And in this work, he did a lot of original research, going through some of the common usages of terms like religious liberty in the Latin language in the 19th century, went over some of the preparatory documents for some of the important documents which were promulgated by Gregory XVI and Blessed Pius IX. So he did a lot of research for this book, and ultimately it is a book arguing against the ability to synthesize Dignitatis Humanae with the Catholic tradition. But in the late 80s, I believe, he had a bit of an epiphany when he was reading through the documents. Again, he had missed a distinction. He had missed a distinction. This isn't something where he drew some sort of crazy distinction from outside of the document. It's actually in the very wording of the document as he was, comparing the text of Dignitatis Humanae with the text of the works of Gregory XVI and Blessed Pius IX. And he recognized that there is a qualification which is made in Dignitatis Humanae, which makes the affirmation completely different than the religious liberty that is rejected as heretical by Gregory XVI and by Blessed Pius IX. So that's a little bit about and then this is a set of journal articles that he wrote on the occasion of wanting to present exactly what that distinction was, to where the man who had so clearly written against Dignitatis Humanae eventually converted and became a Catholic with a few other French traditionalists, and they were joined to the Catholic Church. And Father Lucian, he's actually still alive. I was talking to a priest who had some familiarity with him. He said he's still alive and well, still teaching and going about writing and such. But he's written this, and then there's another English translated work. This is on academia. This one's on academia, but that one is on the magisterial authority of Vatican II, because a lot of people will attempt to, because Vatican II is called a pastoral council, what people will generally do is they'll look at Vatican II and say, this is a pastoral council, therefore I don't have to give the ordinary adherence that I would to an ecumenical council. And in that work on academia, Father Lucian shows that that is not at all in line with what was meant by St. Paul VI or any of the other relevant documents talking about the authority of the Second Vatican Council. So what I want to do first is I want to go in and actually I want to read for you guys the texts side by side, the important doctrinal portion where there is some sort of supposed contradiction between the two. And they have it right here. But what's important is, and I want to clarify this beforehand, is that when we talk about the doctrine of Dignitatis Humanae being in line with the tradition of the church, we don't mean by that every single last thing that is said by Dignitatis Humanae is awesome, or that every last thing said by Dignitatis Humanae is correct. Actually, when we're looking at magisterial documents, we have to remember that there is something called a doctrinal pronouncement. So this is especially clear with papal encyclicals and the documents of Vatican II. There are certain documents in the history of the church, like, for example, if you look at the anathemas of Trent or Vatican I or a lot of other councils, you look at the anathemas or the dogmatic definitions, what you have is you have a type of genre of document where you basically get a thesis stated. So it's basically, if anybody says this, let them be anathema. Or it'll say, we define this to be true. Like you can think about the Creed, for example. It's basically formulated as a doctrinal pronouncement. Now, there's other forms of documents. So this might be a papal allocution, which is a formal speech which is said by the Pope. Or it might be a papal encyclical, or a lot of the documents of Vatican II, where there's not only a doctrinal pronouncement, so they're not only trying to state a thesis, but because it's set in the form of some sort of pastoral document, like an encyclical or like an allocution, it's meant to be a teaching moment. Because these documents are meant to teach, they're meant to argue, they're meant to illustrate, there's a lot of things in that document which is outside of the doctrinal affirmation. So there's a little point of the document that's meant to be binding, and then everything else around it, it isn't meant to bind the consciences of Catholics. It's actually meant to somehow illustrate what is meant to be binding for the intellects of Catholics. So that's a very important distinction that we make there. So there's a certain paragraph within Dignitatis Humanae that is actually meant to be that doctrinal pronouncement. And Father Lucian actually argues that this is something which is infallibly taught. But there's a specific doctrinal affirmation there. But that is what is meant to be binding in the document. So this is it right here, and it's in the second paragraph. But it says, this Vatican Council declares that a human person has a right to religious liberty. This type of liberty consists in the fact that, within necessary limits, all men need to be immune from coercion, whether deriving from individuals, social groups, or any human authority, in any matter of religion, in such a way that no one is forced to act against his conscience, or impeded from acting in accordance with his conscience, regardless of whether he is acting in private or in public, alone or in association with others. Moreover, it declares that the right to religious liberty is in truth based on the very dignity of the human person, which is known both through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious liberty should be recognized in the juridical structure of a society in such a way that it finds expression as a civil right. So that is the doctrinal pronouncement right there. You actually see, and for those who, I forgot to mention this, for those who say that, oh, this is some sort of contrived distinction between various different parts of a document, The relator at Vatican II, when you read the Acta of the Council, the relator actually said explicitly, you don't need to worry. It said to the Council Fathers, you don't really need to worry about these argumentative portions of the text, because that's not the doctrinal pronouncement. So this is something which is consciously understood with the formulation of these texts. So the second one, so that was from Dignitatis Humanae, obviously. The second one is from Quanta Cura. This is from Blessed Pius IX, and he's following Mirari Vos by Gregory XVI. And this says, and against the doctrine of the Scripture, of the Church, and of the Holy Fathers, they do not hesitate to assert that is the best condition of civil society, in which no duty is recognized as attaching to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, except so far as public peace may require. From which totally false idea of social government, they do not fear to foster that erroneous opinion, most fatal in its effects on the Catholic Church and the salvation of souls, called by our predecessor Gregory XVI an insanity, viz., that liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightful constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizen to an absolute liberty, which should be restrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, whereby they may be able openly and publicly to manifest and declare any of their ideas whatever, either by word of mouth, by the press, or in any other way. So you see, when you compare these two documents, is prima facie there seems to be a very serious problem. Because on the one hand, it says in Dignitatis Humanae, I'll highlight specifically the portion that no one, this right to religious liberty is so that no one is either forced to act against his conscience or impeded from acting in accordance with his conscience. So that's what Dignitatis Humanae says. The other hand, what Blessed Pius IX says is that the civil society in which no duty is recognized is attaching to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, except so far as public peace may require. It seems to be prima facie, on the face of things, right in the beginning, that there is some sort of contradiction between the two. There's actually something which, according to Father Lucian's reading, makes this even more difficult. Because what a lot of people say, well, there's a great degree of authority with Dignitatis Humanae, but because Dignitatis Humanae is not an infallible document, one could, in argumentum, one could say that Dignitatis Humanae is incorrect and that the Church has simply not corrected it yet. And that on the other hand, when it comes to the teachings of Blessed Pius IX and the teachings of Gregory XVI and of the tradition before them, that these are actually infallibly taught. Or maybe they don't even say that it's infallibly taught, but they would say that it's more authoritatively proposed. So therefore, a Catholic could, in good conscience, dissent from the teaching of Dignitatis Humanae and agree with the older teaching. But in accordance with what Father Lucian says, and this is on pages, let me see, I think it's 19 to 21. But in accordance with what Father Lucian argues, is he argues that when it comes to both of these texts, that these texts are not merely taught at an authentic, non-infallible level, but actually both of these texts, both Dignitatis Humanae and Quanta Cura, that both of these actually propose infallible teaching. So, and I wondering if I want to read that. I think I want to read that because that might seem very, very controversial. That Dignitatis Humanae is something that teaches infallibly. So, what it says is the text. Okay. So there is, however, something more to be said in this specific instance. So this is talking about Dignitatis Humanae. Indeed, the text of Dignitatis Humanae goes beyond merely stating the existence of this right. The text, the council, the universal magisterium, quote, moreover declares that the right to religious liberty is in truth based on the very dignity of the human person, which is known both through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. End quote. The universal magisterium, therefore, explicitly presents its assertion as necessarily linked to, that is, based on revelation. That is why, while this passage does not include any particular formulas, that allow one to speak of solemn judgment or definition in an extraordinary manner, it is included in what is presented by the ordinary and universal magisterium as definitive to the extent that it is necessarily linked to divine revelation. This assertion is therefore infallibly guaranteed by divine assistance. A fair number of traditionalist authors have questioned whether Vatican II ever involved infallibility. They first claim that Vatican II was not infallible because it was pastoral, and then it goes on to talk about the speeches of St. Paul VI, goes on to talk about a few other documents that people will often quote against Vatican II ever teaching infallibly. But in accordance with what is said right here, is while there were no infallible definitions, and while there wasn't anything which was stated in the extraordinary way, there was an ordinary exercise of infallibility which was presented in Vatican II. And they would say that this clause specifically in Dignitatis Humanae falls under that. And if you want to read more about this, you can read this, or you can read another interesting connected text, because a lot of people will do the same thing with papal encyclicals. A lot of people will think if there is not some sort of ex cathedra definition or extraordinary exercise of the papal magisterium, that somehow infallibility could never be involved. But that's not necessarily accurate. That's not necessary at all. Rather, what you see is that traditionally there were many ecclesiologists who said that there could actually be an ordinary presentation in the papal magisterium of something which was infallible. So you can read Monsignor Joseph Clifford Fenton, his work on papal encyclicals. He goes over this topic in particular. But so this makes actually I haven't even given you the solution yet. But basically, for Father Lucian, this makes the contradiction even worse. Because not only do you have two magisterial texts which are authentic, he would argue that both of these magisterial texts are actually infallibly teaching something. So it's not possible for one to stay Catholic and to agree with both of these. So there's a few principles that I wanted to go over that he presents that I think are helpful before we actually get into explaining what his solution is in general. So first, I wanted to go to, let me see, page, 47. So this is the letter which the Fraternity of St. Vincent Ferrer actually stated with their reading of Dignitatis Humanae. Because it's not that Dignitatis Humanae is awesome. It's not that it's a good document. It's not anything of that sort. It's not that, we like Dignitatis Humanae. Rather, it's that we adhere to its teaching. And this is how he states it. Quote, "One may then say that the declaration is weak, equivocal, dangerous, yet not erroneous in its main teaching. It is weak in its considerations. Some are highly conditioned by their historic and cultural context, as well as by a fairly unrealistic view of things that forgets the concrete conditions of the exercise of freedom as weakened by sin, and also forgets the perversity of some of the forces before which the weak are defenseless. It is equivocal in several of its expressions, so much so that despite the relator's explanations, it is invoked to justify the emancipation of theologians from the magisterium. It is especially dangerous because its omissions expose it to indifferentist interpretations. In its central assertion, however, namely the right to immunity from coercion within the limits of a just public order in religious matters, Dignitatis Humanae does not contradict the prior magisterium and even presents a homogeneous development of doctrine on the social order." And then this is actually and this is from Father Orejo. And he says this is actually from the editors of Sede Sapientiae. They say, taking a different approach, Father Bernard Lucian reached an analogous result in 1992. One can resolve the apparent contradiction between Dignitatis Humanae and the prior magisterium. Accepting the central teaching of a document in no way entails denying its ambiguities and deficiencies. Less yet does it amount to justifying the Second Vatican Council at any cost. If a text actually contradicts an infallible teaching of the Church, there's nothing to be done to justify it. Conversely, however, if this contradiction can be resolved, the deficiencies in the text do not justify rejecting it. Furthermore, the clarifications that the magisterium has provided in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which resolve certain ambiguities, clearly support continuity. This issue still presents difficulties for some Catholics and is a stumbling block for the Society of St. Pius X, which is why a review is tackling the subject again. Give me 1 second.
If you really enjoy this channel, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/militant Thomist. At the first level, you get access to the private Discord. At the second level, you get access to weekly bonus videos. At the third level, you get access to free translations, articles, and notes on the Summa of St. Thomas. On the fourth level, you get access to course videos and DM questions. And beyond this, there are many other benefits, so please make sure to check out patreon.com/militant Thomist. Do you want to have access to more videos and custom interaction whilst also helping out the channel? If so, please consider becoming a YouTube member. At the first level, for only $3 a month, get access to custom emojis to use in live streams and in the comment section. At the second level, for only $5 a month, get access to a weekly bonus stream. At the third level, for only $10 a month, get access to priority replies on all your comments. Click the join button below or the link in the description to find out more.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, one does not need to, in order to adhere to the teaching of Dignitatis Humanae, one does not need to say it's awesome, say it's the best document ever, say that it's there's no ambiguities, no equivocations, and that it argues the best way, it concretely applies things the best way. Nobody needs to say any of those things. Rather, what's central has to do with the doctrinal pronouncement, which is present especially in the second paragraph of the document. So another thing that he brings up, which I think is important before we get into the actual resolution that he brings up, is his methodology, because he has a certain methodological approach. And basically, this methodological approach can be best described in a similar way as we deal with the relationship between the natural reason and the mysteries of the faith. Because when it comes to natural reason and the mysteries of the faith, it's not necessary for us by natural reason to show that, or to intimately resolve all of the antinomies, or to intimately resolve possible apparent contradictions. Rather, it's enough for us to show that these are not necessary, right? So in an analogous way, that's how he treats resolutions of apparent contradictions between magisterial texts. It's necessary, the onus of proof is on the other individual to show how necessarily, without any sort of room for escape, that there is an unequivocal, complete, and necessary contradiction between two magisterial texts. So the burden of proof is on the person which is arguing for the contradiction. Rather, the theologian, the one who is defending the magisterial document, they can simply show that this contradiction is not necessary by way of some distinction that is either explicitly or implicitly presented in the text. Oh my goodness. Vatican II isn't dogmatic, right? Read Father Lucian's other paper. Somebody get it from academia and post a link, and I'll put it on the screen. But this is how he describes this. I really like this, so I kind of want to read the whole thing, just because this is the way in which I think about resolving possible apparent contradictions between magisterial texts. But he basically says, faced with a magisterial text truly authentic, whether it is infallible or not, every Catholic at first spontaneously, and with the very spontaneity of the life of faith, adopts a habitual and global tendency towards adherence. So by global, he means universal. To this attitude on the part of the faithful corresponds in any authentic magisterial statement a key fact about its meaning, namely the most relevant context of an authentic magisterial text, precisely as authentic, is the totality of the revealed datum, and more precisely, the totality of what the magisterium has already determined. This is why, even in the case of a simply authentic text, the faithful's a priori attitude is one of reception and comprehension of its statements, in a sense that conforms to the totality of former teachings. So basically what he's saying here, and this is kind of explaining in a little bit more complex terms the idea of the hermeneutic of continuity, but what he's saying is that the adherence that the faithful have to magisterial texts, this adherence is something which is in some way simple. And by simple, what that means is that it's not somehow isolated from all of the other acts that it makes towards the teaching of the magisterium and towards divine revelation. Rather, when we accept and adhere to any teaching, it's always going to be in a global sense. It's always going to be in a sense that is in line with and includes all of the other objects of adherence that is previously brought forward in the magisterium, that is brought forward the magisterium in its other organs, etc. So you can't have this pick and choose approach, is what he's saying. Is you can't have or an approach of breaking with the tradition, to where you are going to somehow accept a magisterial text not only in a sense presented that is out of line with the rest of the teaching of the magisterium, because the teaching of the magisterium is somehow a whole, entire, and simple. So this is why he says, further, if a new text includes in its actual wording several possible interpretations, which occurs, let's say 2 interpretations, of which one is compatible with its former teaching and the other is contradictory to it, it is the compatible interpretation that is the true meaning, the magisterial and authentic meaning of the new document. Such is the attitude required of every Catholic believer, be he theologian or not, cleric or not, and it is that adopted by the theologians whom Father Harry quotes. Such is the attitude he has forgotten. This is what prevents him from proceeding in a correct Catholic manner in the discussion of Dignitatis Humanae. Indeed, and this is my ultimate conclusion regarding this matter of method, it follows from the theological situation I've described above that if, a case that I admit as a possibility, a Catholic thinks that he discerns a true contradiction between a new text of the authentic magisterium, supposing that it is not infallible, and a prior teaching, the burden of proof rests with him. So if you have these 2 interpretations ad literam, so in accordance with the letter or the wording, to which 2 interpretations are possible, so you can go through, to give like a weird remote example, when you look at a commentary from St. Thomas on Scripture, St. Thomas will often give 2 or 3 different interpretations of the text, of the letter of the text, that is given by the Church Fathers, and that don't necessarily contradict the scope of the text or the letter itself. If you had 2 or 3 interpretations of a biblical text, one of these interpretations was in line with some other biblical teaching, or the teaching of the church, or the teaching of tradition, or whatever else, and the 2 others were against it, the authentic sense, which one ought to accept, would be the one that was coherent, not the one that was incoherent. So the burden of proof would lie on the person saying, no, the only text or the only reading which coheres with the letter of the text is the one which is contradictory with the previous tradition or with this other text, right? So he's saying that the burden of proof when it comes to these sort of discussions is a bit different. It's not enough to pretend like the 2 people are on the same plane. The Catholic must be able to point to something immediately obvious or to a conclusive argument to be able to assert the fact of contradiction. This is what I had done, or rather what I had thought that I had done in my work on Gregory XVI, Pius IX, and Vatican II. That work, however, was only conclusive to the extent that it claimed to establish that there is no possible interpretation in favor of non-contradiction. With God's grace, however, I've now provided a possible interpretation in favor of this non-contradiction. It is an interpretation that is not refuted by any of the existing works on the subject that I'm aware of. This, then, is why I must adhere, whether absolutely or relatively, depending on whether infallibility is engaged, to the central text of Dignitatis Humanae, even if I cannot positively justify this new doctrinal statement on the basis of sound theological arguments. And this, by the way, may sound weird. Like, I have to adhere to it even if I cannot find the right theological arguments to justify it. But this basically comes with the true and authentic understanding of obsequium religiosum, is you give religious adherence not because you have somehow devised theological arguments which were positively proof of what the magisterium says, but because of the impulse of faith which adheres to the teaching of the magisterium. So that may sound weird, but it's not as weird as it sounds. Everyone believes in this, even traditionalists. Even if I cannot positively justify this new doctrinal statement on the basis of sound theological arguments, even if I'm not able to establish positively the continuity between this new statement and earlier statements. Of course, what here applies to me likewise applies to any Catholic, including Father Harry. Yet he has not, in fact, brought out the impossibility of my conciliatory interpretation. Or yet, has he not, in fact, brought out the impossibility of my conciliatory interpretation? That is what we shall examine in my second part. I beg the reader, however, to keep in mind the methodological conclusion. Given the situation, it is up to Father Harry to establish rigorously the impossibility of my interpretation, whereas all I need to point to is its non-impossibility. Sorry. So basically, what those who object to the teaching of the magisterium need to do is they actually have to positively render all of these readings or possible interpretations impossible. Or all we have to do is say that it is not impossible, if that makes sense. That is the methodological conclusion that he brings forward. So this is all before we've even gotten into. So this is why I like this text, because it goes into things like that, which I think is very important for being able to read it. And there's a few other really cool methodological considerations that he brings forward. But most importantly is the actual solution that he's going to give. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring up because it can be a little bit hard to understand, especially if you're not used to reading these types of documents. But I'm going to bring up my little whiteboard so I can type out a few things for you guys so you're able to better understand it. But basically, when it comes to his solution that he actually provides, so on page, he has a few different formulations of it. There's 3 formulations, so I'm going to just give 2 of them because I think that'll be fine enough. I don't want to belabor the point with the distinction that he gives. So for him, he basically views this under 2 different terms. So when it comes to what is condemned pre-Vatican II, so the form of religious liberty that is condemned pre-Vatican II is that someone has the freedom of religion insofar as in religious matters he can do whatever he wants. That's basically the idea of religious freedom pre-Vatican II. Is what they're condemning is somebody can act in whatsoever way, and unless it's not contrary to the public order, so unless it's not, like the Mormons or whatever, unless it's not contrary to the public order, then you're actually just able to kind of do whatever you want, right? So this is different in accordance with Father Lucian's reading. So this is Father Lucian's reading of Vatican II. He says that what Vatican II teaches, so this is condemned, just to clarify, that's not what the pre-Vatican II popes are teaching. Condemned. So what Vatican II is teaching is that someone has the freedom from religious coercion insofar as he follows his conscience in religious matters. So these 2, according to him, follows his conscience and do whatever you want. These are 2 completely different things. So if you are advocating for a freedom of religion for whatever you want, it's for people who follow their conscience, people who don't follow their conscience, no matter what, you know. But for Father Lucian's reading of Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae is simply talking about a freedom of coercion for those who follow their conscience. Now, we need to be a little bit clear about what is meant by conscience right here, because conscience is going to be something which is objective, right? It is the proximate rule. It's called the proximate rule of moral action. So the proximate rule of moral action is what is in accordance with, or whereby one is attaching themselves, making a practical judgment of what is in line with what is objectively presented to them. So I'm making a judgment in the practical and moral order of the fact that this is an action which is in accordance with objective principles. So that's what conscience is, which makes it slightly different than a lot of the ideas of conscience, which were completely like subjectivist ideas. So when you read, for example, the teaching of like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it talks about religious freedom, the individuals in the UN Declaration of Religious Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, or whatever it's called, these people have a completely subjectivist understanding of conscience. They don't have an objectivist understanding of conscience like is dogmatically taught by the Catholic Church. But this is what he actually says. I might not have put it in the most illuminating terms. Actually, let me just divide it like this. This might be helpful. So he says that there can basically be three situations. You can have somebody who is acting against their conscience in religious matters. So this would be, for example, you have a Catholic society where there is general promulgation of Catholic truth. The motives of credibility of the Catholic religion are before people's eyes. They see it all the time. And this person, despite what is presented to them, they act against conscience and they try to promulgate atheism, or they promulgate some sort of heresy. This person is acting against their conscience, and therefore they would be able to be punished by the state. Then you would have somebody acting whether against or for conscience in religious matters against the common good. So you have the second place where somebody's acting whether against or for their conscience, or in accordance with their conscience in religious matters against the common good. So this individual, they would be able to be punished as well, by the way. So you have two different situations where somebody could be punished in accordance with this reading of Dignitatis Humanae. And then there's a third case, and this third case is that you have somebody who is acting in accordance with conscience, and notice this is an erroneous conscience, in religious matters not against the common good. And what Vatican II is saying in Dignitatis Humanae, again, in accordance with Father Lucian's reading, however far you buy this or not, it's saying that this third person right there, so somebody who's acting in accordance with the conscience in religious matters, and they're not acting against the common good, this individual in particular ought to be free from coercion. So this is what he actually says. In my view, the essential difference between the right affirmed by Dignitatis Humanae and that condemned by Gregory XVI and Pius IX consists in this. On the one hand, Dignitatis Humanae affirms the natural right to the external liberty to act in religious matters according to one's conscience. So that's the operative distinction right there, according to one's conscience. On the other hand, the two popes mentioned, so Gregory XVI and Blessed Pius IX, deny the existence of a natural right to the external liberty to act in religious matters as one wishes. And he says, it is easy to verify these two affirmations by referring to the central sentence of Dignitatis Humanae for the first, and the first two chapters of my book for the second. So it's very interesting, is that when it comes to the second one, a lot of people may find that to be very weird. That's specifically the popes in the 19th century were actually condemning only acting in accordance with one wishes. In order to verify this, he sends people to the book that he wrote. The book that he wrote, which is one of the best historical and lexicographical studies of Gregory the 16th and Pius the Ninth, which is written on this issue of religious liberty, that he wrote when he was against Vatican II's teaching on religious liberty. So it's very interesting, actually, to see this. And he says, indeed, it is quite possible, and alas, very common, for a man to act as he wishes, though not according to his conscience. In fact, one who sins often acts against his conscience, whereas in other cases, he acts according to his culpably erroneous conscience. It can even happen that man, hardened to the point of indifference towards good and evil, acts absent any judgment of conscience. Moreover, the judgment of conscience in every man is exercised by practical reason, which first apprehends the general principles of the moral order, to do good, not to do evil. This knowledge of universal principles is per se accessible to every human intelligence. This objective accessibility also applies to the fact of divine revelation, fulfilled and completed in Jesus Christ, since this revelation is accompanied by signs of credibility that are both highly certain and also adapted to the intelligence of all men. So this is in accordance, interestingly enough, with what is being taught by Vatican I. So Vatican I says when it comes to the motives of credibility for the Catholic religion, when it comes to the fecundity of the Catholic Church, her indefectibility, the Church as a miracle of the social order, et cetera, when it comes to prophecies and miracles, when it comes to all of these things, it actually adapts the truth of the Catholic religion. This is something which is adapted to the understanding of all. So when you have certain people who, upon seeing all of these motives of credibility, they are acting against this, there can actually be a presumption in the civil authority that this person is acting against their conscience. And therefore, when it comes to the civil authority is able to punish this figure, because while they aren't able to get in and reach into people's minds and see whether they are actually acting in accordance with conscience or not, they're able to make a judicially certain judgment when they're talking with these people, which is, this is presumed by many different areas of both natural law and many different areas of Catholic theology. So there's no problem with having this distinction right here. And he says, to be sure, knowledge of the general principles of morality and religion vary from one person to the next, according to the circumstances of social background, upbringing, and other more individual factors. But these diverse circumstances, which shape one's access to the knowledge of general and universal principles, are of themselves observable from the outside. Therefore, that person can be held culpable or liable for it. Therefore, at least in part and in certain cases, it is possible to form a prudential judgment from the outside, supposing one has a legitimate reason to do so, regarding whether or not somebody is acting according to his conscience or not. Those who wish to study, then he goes into St. Thomas on a certain point. Those who wish to study this aspect further will refer to the classic discussions on the notion of just war. And then he goes over how there has to be a proven culpability in the doctrine of St. Thomas. Hence, the right to act as one wishes not only is formally different from the right to act according to one's conscience, but in fact grants far more, at least under some societal circumstances, in terms of exemption from constraint. There is then no contradiction between the condemnation of the former and the assertion of the latter. So basically what he's saying is that in terms of, if I wanted to take these two affirmations, so I wanted to take the affirmation of Dignitatis Humanae, and I wanted to take the affirmation, let's say, of Gregory the 16th, and I wanted to take and to distill these into affirmations. So I wanted to distill a thesis statement from Gregory the 16th, and I wanted to distill a thesis statement from Dignitatis Humanae. If you put these two next to each other, there is not a necessary contradiction between the two, right? They are not opposed as to affirmation and negation. There is no, one may sound cringe, one may sound based, one may sound weird, one may not sound weird, one may make sense, one may not make sense, but there is no formal contradiction between these two statements. And therefore, he's saying that one is not able to posit a contradiction because of what we talked earlier about the burden of proof of the person who opposes the magisterium of the church, right? So now I want to go to his second solution, which is in his second article in this matter, which is on page 31. And there's a third solution, the third one, but I don't want to belabor the point. So he says, remember that, in my view, the essential difference between the right asserted by Dignitatis Humanae and that condemned by Gregory XVI and Pius IX consists in the following. Dignitatis Humanae asserts the natural right to the external liberty to act in religious matters according to one's conscience. And according to one's conscience is put in all caps. The analysis of the text of the two popes mentioned above shows that they deny the existence of a natural right to the external liberty to act in religious matters as one wishes. So, as one wishes is distinct from according to conscience. This distinction between acting as one wishes and acting according to one's conscience is entirely elementary and well known to all writers since the Old Testament, though it has been expressed in a diversity of ways. In any human act, man acts as he wishes. This is because man is free, and every truly human act occurs under the control of the will guided by reason. On the other hand, since the judgment of conscience applies general principles, natural and supernatural, of action to a particular case, man can follow his conscience. On the one hand, I know that theft is evil. I see that this act would be theft. I do not commit this act. That's following your conscience. Act against his conscience. I know that theft is evil. I know that these delicious cakes are not mine. Pushed by gluttony, I devour them anyways. This person knows that theft is evil, does it anyways. That's acting against your conscience. Or even act without conscience. A man may be so accustomed to living according to his passions that he no longer even forms a judgment of conscience. The sacred scriptures speak in the sense of those who drink iniquity like water, and the moralists often use the expression a, quote, seared conscience. The distinction I'm using is therefore a distinction between a whole of human acts, so human acts of any genus, or any species rather, and its truly distinct parts, the three categories among human acts in relation to the judgment of conscience. This distinction is so elementary that even children perceive it, at least according to conscience versus against conscience, well before they even turn 7. Now, the application of this distinction to shed light on the problem of a right to civil liberty in religious matters may be new, but this is in no way constitutes a difficulty or an objection, except that is, for such persons as harbor a false conception of tradition and are suspicious of anything that does not materially and literally repeat the expressions of the past. On the contrary, in Vatican II, there is obviously the acknowledgement of a development of doctrine on the question of religious liberty. It is therefore normal, legitimate, and Catholic for the theologian to endeavor to shed light on this development by means of arguments or distinctions that have not been formulated so far. Otherwise, the development would already have taken place. A Catholic approach to the situation leads me to say, if this distinction is required to bring out the agreement among the diverse texts of the magisterium, then it is by that very fact founded upon the authority of the magisterium and substantially traditional. So that right there is the second explanation, which, it's kind of just clear. It's everybody knows that acting as one wishes, basically acting in accordance with one's will, is really distinct from the various different categories of acting for or against conscience. So he goes on in another place, and this is an interesting point, because there's going to be a lot of related questions. So there's going to be related questions of basically like a related question of how ought we act now? Like, how could a government act now? How about the governments of the past? And things like this. And there's a few places where he discusses this, but I wanted to read one or two of them because I found them to be very helpful. Actually, I just wanted to read one of them. There was a second one I was going to read, but I don't really feel like it. So that's on pages 8 to 11 if you want to read that one and you have a copy yourself. So this is on page 56. So it says, according to Dignitatis, and then this is the thesis, religious liberty does not prevent a Catholic society from impeding the public exercise of false religions as such. So it says, according to Dignitatis number 2, The human person has a right to religious liberty, both in private and public, alone and with others. This is a right not to be forced to act against one's conscience, or not to be impeded from acting according to one's conscience within due limits in religious matters. Now, in a Catholic society, the authorities may legitimately presume that public acts against the Catholic religion are acts contrary to conscience. For example, formal sins of heresy, schism, infidelity, blasphemy, sacrilege, etc. Therefore, religious liberty does not protect these acts. So he's saying that in accordance with religious liberty, and the teaching of Vatican II on religious liberty, we're actually able to punish various different sins like heresy, blasphemy, acts of irreligion, things like this. Therefore, according to Dignitatis Humanae, a Catholic society may legitimately impede the public acts of religious error as such, and not merely because of public order. Because even the liberals thought that you could impede public religious acts in accordance with the public order. And actually, the Catechism goes further and clarifies that it's not public order; it's actually a public order as constituted by the common good, which is further than the liberals in that case, which places us far outside of the limits of indifferentism. Here's how the minor premise is established. In a Catholic society, the authorities may legitimately presume that public acts against the Catholic religion are acts against conscience. The truth of Catholicism, which possesses objective signs of credibility that are of themselves accessible to the understanding of all, constitutes an objective fact. In a Catholic society, this truth is knowable and supposed to be known to all. True religion, at least in its essential dogmas and laws, is a matter of public knowledge. So in the same way, for example, as we can assume the public knowledge of, the lawlessness of murder, and therefore we can presume this is a generally known moral fact. And there may be very extraordinary cases where somebody is not morally culpable for murder, and pleads of insanity and things like that. But in the general and normal case, we can have this general presumption that somebody actually does in conscience know that murder is wrong, and therefore if he murders, he's acting against conscience. Let us suppose an individual speaks out or acts against this Catholic religion. It may legitimately be presumed that he is not acting according to his conscience, but rather against the judgment of his conscience. If the public authorities impede this act, the person in question cannot invoke religious liberty against the authorities' intervention. I'm not saying that civil authorities have the right to impede any act a person may commit against his conscience. State intervention must be limited as possible, must be as limited as possible, and must have a just motive. I don't know about that. But if need be, religious liberty does not prevent the authorities from intervening. Okay, so lastly, what I wanted, before I get into all of the questions that I'm sure you guys are going to have, and as a reminder, as I said, this is me book reviewing. This is not, there's a lot more research that I actually want to do with religious liberty, for sure. So I don't have all the answers to all your questions, which is why I haven't done an actual edited video or anything like that on religious liberty. So there's a possible objection from the text that I wanted to go over that a lot of people I know are going to bring up. So I just wanted to get it out of the way right now. So let me get a drink of water first. Some passages of the Conciliar Declaration would appear to have been written from the perspective of a right to act as one wishes, and not just according to one's conscience. The most characteristic passage is at the end of number 2. Therefore, the right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, but in his very nature. In consequence, the right to this immunity continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it. Despite the impression this text gives at first glance, the second sentence does not assert the right to act as one wishes. The immunity in question is the right previously defined, that is, the right to act according to one's conscience. So basically, it's talking about the distinction between an invincibly erroneous conscience and a vincibly erroneous conscience. But it's still acting in accordance with conscience. Anyways, it's kind of like the scholastic distinction that gets brought forward. The sentence asserts that one who does not satisfy the obligation mentioned preserves this right. That much is true. But the sentence does not assert, although it does seem to suggest it, that he who behaves in this way is always, and as it were unquestionably, acting according to his conscience. Nor does it say that one must necessarily and always consider him to be acting according to his conscience. In fact, according to the first of the two quoted sentences, the purpose of the passage is to underscore the objective character of the right it asserts, which is therefore independent of the individual's efforts to acquire a right conscience and is not based on that potential effort. This point remains intact in the interpretation I am proposing. My interpretation is founded not only on the literal meaning of the passage, but also on the reference that the conciliar text makes at precisely this place to the statement of Leo XIII and Pius XII. This guarantees that it is indeed in a traditional, realist, and objective sense that the council here speaks of acting according to one's conscience. Perhaps some few other passages, too, seem to suggest or presuppose the right to act as one wishes. I shall here recall that only the right as it is defined in Dignitatis Humanae number 2 is presented both as the direct object of conciliar teaching and is founded on revelation. This teaching alone can lay claim to the absolute guarantee of divine assistance. That is what, and it is perfectly compatible with formally defined dogma, as we have seen, must serve as the norm of interpretation for the contentious passages, not the other way around. We are here touching upon an essential point, which will surely be brought further into light during the discussions initiated by Benedict XVI's address on the hermeneutic of Vatican II. Divine assistance, in its various degrees, properly concerns the magisterium in the exercise of its act, and not the prior discussions in which men speak, with no more than their own human capacities. This is why the context that bestows its meaning on a new text of the magisterium is more formally made up of the body of doctrine already formally taught than by the personal orientations of the speakers during the elaboration of the documents. This, of course, does not imply that the study of preparatory documents, discussions, and the diverse drafts of the final document are of no use in understanding it. That, however, is not what sheds the ultimate decisive light. The next paragraph will illustrate this clarification. It goes over the divine assistance to these paragraphs. But basically, what this is saying is that this is not texts like this are not saying that this is acting in accordance with what any way one wishes. It's just saying even with a vincibly erroneous conscience, if one acts in accordance with that, it's still the object of the right which is defined. Anyways, sorry for that drag. I felt like I read unnecessarily too long when I was reading that quote. But yeah, it's been an hour. Buy the book. The link that I have below, the link that I have in the description, in the text pinned in the comments. This is one of those. What are they called? Affiliate links. One of those affiliate links. So I get a kickback from Amazon. So yeah, pick it up. It's a very good book. I found it to be very helpful. I wanna do a little bit more research though into his first two chapters on Gregory the 16th and Blessed Pius IX on religious liberty in his French book. So I will. If any of you guys have a scan or some sort of digital copy of that, that would be awesome. Unfortunately, I'm not able to get any of that. So I probably will have to buy a physical copy if none of you guys have it. So comment below if you have any of those. Okay, now I'll get into the questions. But I hope that was helpful. I found that to be very interesting. River Run, what do you think about that? I see River Runs in the chat. Yeah. Keep my brother David in your prayers. He's doing focus and got assigned to Belmont Abbey. You were mentioned being near Raleigh. Thought of you. Oh, I'm actually I'm not near Belmont Abbey, but I am near Mooresville. So I'm close to the area. All China will be Catholic. Unleash the kingdom of heaven. True. Happy birthday to my favorite Catholic YouTuber. Not directly related to the topic, but what should I be aware of when reading philosophical works of non-Christian like Ibn Sina's Avicenna? Don't say just no. We Latinize the names. The Book of Healing. St. Thomas was influenced by him, so he must have read him through a lens. I mean, you can read these authors. You probably just need to have an acquaintance with what Catholic authors say on the same topic before you go into it. And remember, if you ever are having any sort of weakness when it comes to certain adherence to doctrines or dogmas of the faith, that one abstain from reading that type of material, because then one places themselves in proximate danger of error, which you are not allowed to do. 2 McChickens for your birthday present. Thank you, Morse Ultra. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the gifted memberships. Happy month of the Sacred Heart. Thank you. Vatican II isn't dogmatic, as per all its teachings being infallibly declared, conceded, as per all its teachings being authentic, denied. I want to talk to you about this, River. I want to talk to you about this, because I think I would probably do a sub distinction on this, not necessarily just a twofold distinction. Joe Forty, thank you for becoming a member. How do we define the common good? Can't a modernist say that it's subjective? Yeah, they can say it's subjective, but the church has, when you look throughout her various different documents, you can look at something like the Compendium of Social Teaching. You can look at the Catechism itself. You can look at things like Veritatis Splendor. When the church is teaching on things like conscience and the common good, the church actually has teachings like, this is how we define it. This is what it is. Like, this is what we teach. So when it comes to the common good is basically that good which is possessed in common that does not diminish when possessed, which sounds like really weird. But it's distinguished from various different private goods. So private goods could be, this book right here, that is a private good. Like, if you have it, I don't have it. Or even things like wealth, which is held in common among various different people. That is a private good, because wealth, as it is communicated, it is diminished. So the common good are talking about those things in which we can all continue to increase and share and possess. So ultimately, the object of the common good is God, because we can all possess God without diminishing him because of his infinitude. But really, common goods are going to be things like friendship, virtue, morality, public order. These are various different iterations of the common good. But ultimately, this is concerned with our final end, which is the beatific vision. So there's a certain preparation that we have in nature, being guarded from those things which are going to contradict our last end, and then also positively dispose us towards our last end. So this is why there's a certain degree of, and we have to be very careful by using this term, there's a certain degree of secularity in the state, right? And the secularity in the state is nothing more than, what Leo XIII talks about in Immortali Dei, where it's the fact that we actually have, like, the church and the state are perfect societies, and therefore there's a degree of independence that they have. So in that sense, there is a secularity of the state, but in the sense that there's a separation between the two, as in those who are members of government, who are Catholic, can somehow only consider those things which are naturally known, or the fact that the government ought not to have any concern with the final end of man. There's not a subordination of ends. No, that would be completely wrong. So to make the distinction, thus, there's not a morphing of ends. So there's not one single proximate end to the church and the state. Like, there's not that morphing that occurs. But there is a subordination of ends. St. Thomas, he talks about this in De Regno. There's a subordination of ends insofar as the end of the state is subordinated to the end of the church, and the state, due to the moral necessity of divine revelation, is dependent on the church for various types of direction and knowledge. But it's not like the two societies morph into one. I don't know why I went on that tangent, but yeah, I hope that helps. Check your Telegram. I'm writing something. Would you consider having American Reform on for a stream? We've talked about it. We've talked about it before. The topics are a bit controversial that we are commonly interested in talking about. So that might be one of those Rumble only streams. But yeah, we have talked about it, and I haven't ruled it out or anything like that. There's no reason why I see that I would rule out a stream with him. Scholastic Zoomer, you gonna freak out, Sicilianus? Oh yeah, Scholastic Zoomer. I forgot to reban you. Okay, here we go. Bam. Yeah, we're talking about the legitimate secularity of the state. We need to have the it's kind of funny is Pius XII. He has such a way with words. He was like we need to have a sort of legitimate secularism, and then he also says we need to have a legitimate racism. What did he mean by these? what did he mean by these? Yeah, the legitimate secularism quote is basically just talking about the fact that they're perfect societies and have distinct ends, and there needs to be a proper subordination. It's threading the needle between a sort of laicization of the church and and a sort of clericalization of the state. It's threading the needle between that and then separation of church and state. That's all the language is meant to illustrate. Anyways, but yeah, I do agree that the language does sound really weird. Let Scholastic Zoomer follow his conscience. No, he's acting against conscience because the Second Vatican Council has very many motives of credibility. And therefore, I, as a legitimate authority, have decided to smite Scholastic Zoomer for acting against his conscience in the public forum. So I'm actually acting very much in accordance with the teaching of the Second Vatican Council and of Dignitatis Humanae. Okay, so if Father Lucian's thesis has not received approbation from the conciliar hierarchy, what value does it have in harmonizing Dignitatis Humanae with tradition? Does an authentic interpretation belong to the authority? Well, he does go into texts from Benedict XVI and from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which he says actually is simply a statement of exactly what Dignitatis Humanae is talking about. But he does have that comment. I read it earlier. I read it earlier, but I'm trying to find it now. Specifically, what he says, because he responds. This is basically what Father Hervey says. So, if you want to like the full response, in the second article, he responds to what Father Hurry, sorry, not Hervey, Hurry, says, and he basically argues the same thing, but he brings it forward in the first article, where he says, I'm probably not going to be able to find it. Dang. Well, I read it earlier, even if I can't find it now. But basically, in the second article, what he argues is that when it comes to the possible interpretations of the text ad literam, there doesn't need to be necessarily like a representation or a re-explanation of the text in order for this to somehow be the legitimate interpretation. In the same way as when you have, the Nicene Creed, or when you have the Creed of Chalcedon, or when you have the Confession at Ephesus, or any of these other documents, in order for one to adhere to the sense of the document, they don't need to have the magisterium provide like a second layer of interpretation. So he's saying that this is just from the literal exegesis of the text. So he's saying that like ad literam, like this is what the letters, the words, the affirmations and negations of the text just are. So this is the sense of the text, and there doesn't really need to be like a second iteration of, okay, I'm going to go and explain what the text means. In the same way as like the next day after Vatican I closed, you didn't need to have papal infallibility double explained for you and by the magisterium of the church in order for you to adhere to its teaching. So he's simply saying from a strict exegesis of the text, that's where he's getting this from, and not necessarily. That's why I said in the beginning of the stream, this isn't like an extrinsic imposition on the text. This is just what the text says. Also, would you consider ever discussing the crisis in the church with somebody who holds to the thesis of De Laurier? I really haven't. What I would be more interested in with if somebody wanted to talk about De Laurier is sedoprivationism in the Dominican tradition, because I have read, and I'd be interested. Actually, what would be cool is if there was somebody who was really experienced in the thesis and was really interested in De Laurier, because Astro's read a lot about it. I've read a good bit about it from the Dominican tradition, talking about whether De Laurier's thesis is actually a valid a valid reiteration of what the Dominican tradition teaches about papal deposition, I would be much more interested in that sort of discussion. Um, because I think De Laurier, I don't think that he authentically um, represents the teaching of the Dominican tradition. Free Grover till it's backwards. Read Dominus Jesus, so true. Yeah, and also this is something that this point by Riveron is very important as well. When you look at the role of the theologian as envisioned in, I'm probably thinking of Humani Generis, but when you look at the role of the theologian as envisaged by the church, the theologian is supposed to be that individual which provides um, like in the schools, provides a sort of synthetic presentation of all of the documents of the church. Like the church isn't obviously the church is a magister, the church is a magister, but the church isn't necessarily like synthesizing everything into cascading sets of theses and drawing forth conclusions and showing the connection between various different doctrines and improving it from the remote rule of faith. That's not necessarily what the church is here to do. So like it is, I think, perfectly in line in the purview of a theologian to do exactly what is being done here. I don't know how else one would have the scholastic practice of objections and responses at the end of every thesis, unless a theologian was able to do something like this. Genuine question: how can this be reconciled with what the Council of Vienne and what it says on Islam? What you have to remember is, and oh yeah, so that's funnily enough, this is actually the part of the text that I didn't read, so I'll get the exact portion for you. It does talk about the traditional praxis of the church. Oh, page 8 through 11. Yeah, I'm not going to read the whole thing for you. I'm assuming you can yourself find the digital copy or pick up a copy for yourself. But basically, the idea is they would argue, and they give various different examples, which I find to be very very cool. Also, the third article as well goes into this. So there's two places where it goes into this, where it shows an awareness of theologians of the time and of the generations after, especially during the Baroque period, and also draws forth from the doctrine of Saint Thomas that when it comes to those types of exercises of the authority of the magistrate, there was the assumption that these people were culpably acting against conscience, and that it would have been inappropriate, and it was declared inappropriate in other similar cases. So yeah, that is, that's the answer that they give, is that which follows from the example of the church praxis that I brought up earlier within a Catholic state. Good question. What pages? So the pages on what? Dang, I'm like 8 minutes behind. Okay, never mind. I'm not. It's not the pages of what I was just talking about. Yeah, this was just completely wrong. The Spanish Episcopal Conference in 1979 statement pushed for a state that does not impose a single religion. Yeah, that was a huge L, because even as most will, like if you read, for example, a text that you should read is Lefebvre's response. And this is like a semi-official interpretation. It wasn't promulgated uh, by the Pope, and it was meant for sort of particular purpose. But the CDF response to the dubia of Lefebvre on religious liberty, it talks about confessional states. And what's crazy is that the Spanish Episcopal Conference said this, but if you look back to when Franco took over, and this is something that Cardinal Taviani brings up when he's praising um, the Spanish adherence to the Catholic faith, he brings up the fact that there actually wasn't it wasn't illegal to practice other religions than Catholicism. There was specifically in law, there was not a criminalization of public acts of religion from other religions. So, like, what exactly were they a-logging Franco about? Like, what exactly were they saying? Because there's really nothing in their praxis. Because there's confessionalization is not against the teaching of the church. You look at the response to Lefebvre. You can also look at the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, yeah, the one written early 2000s. It talks about the recognition of the unique recognition of the church by the state, and says that that's fine. Really, it's kind of just as a matter of praxis. St. John Paul II talks about this. It's kind of just a matter of praxis that we don't explicitly ask for the confessionalization. But Benedict XVI, he talks about a substantial confessionalization, to basically where you don't need necessarily a de jure confessionalization. You basically just have like a de facto one. Anyways, but yeah, that was awful. The Episcopal Conference should not have done that. Bishops in the 70s. Are you denying bishops hold authority? Are you denying bishops hold authority? Okay, well, I just gave you like 4 other authorities that are higher than an Episcopal Conference. But Episcopal conferences during the 70s were like saying that contraception was okay. Like, come on now. Are you going to quote a bishops conference from the 70s? That's not smart. Never trust what a bishops conference says in the 1970s. It's almost 100% coal. Yeah, so true. We love St. Paul VI. What do you think about the way in which Dignitatis Humanae is used after the council? Do you think it is compatible with this reading of Dignitatis Humanae? I think I would have to go case by case, because really what you have to remember when it comes to the public action of the church, falls under, and I talked about this actually on Twitter earlier, the Jus Publicum Externum, the basically like the public external law of the relationship between church and state. And on these matters of praxis, and Ottaviani talks about this in his manual on this, and I think we've talked about this before. In these public matters of praxis, like, there are a lot of different cases in which the church calls for different things that are not necessarily matters of ideal, but are only matters of prudence. So I would need to see specifically the justifications which are given, like the particular instance, etc. But like by the 1960s, like when Ottaviani gave his speech, his famous Lateran speech in 1952, I believe, when he gave his famous Lateran speech in 1952, there were various different diplomats to the Vatican, Catholic diplomats from Catholic states with confessionalization in their constitutions, who like freaked out from what Ottaviani said. So I mean, at that point, it was a sort of practically dead sort of connection. So in line with the laws of Jus Publicum, like one could like prudentially call for a preservation. That's what Ottaviani talks about, calling for a preservation of the rights of the church, even amidst a collapse of confessionalization of the state. So yeah, I would need to. I definitely would be open to various different instances in which this was a bad way of acting, but I would not entirely chalk each and every one of them up to it. You know, I tend to not have a very negative. Well, I tend to try not to, would be a better way of putting it. I tend to try not to have a very negative view of a cleric unless I have to during this era. Keeps me sane on these things. Unrelated, but did JP1 teach anything? Yeah, I mean, you can go to his thing on Vatican.va. Any questions on the death penalty? I replied on. Oh, any comments on the death penalty? I replied on X. Did you read the Cardinal Dulles essay that I sent you? I mean, for me personally, I end up tending, very practically speaking, pro death penalty. I mean, I guess it would just be a question of how we read the the declarations of the Pope and which declarations are authentic exercises of the magisterium and which aspects of that are doctrinal pronouncements. That's kind of where the conversation goes. But any comments on the death penalty? I guess what I said to you earlier is kind of restricted to it. Doesn't the thesis explicitly reject canonical deposition of the popes? I don't have. Well, I mean the particular point in which this connects with the Dominican thesis is the Dominican thesis has a certain part where they talk about how the papal charism can be lost, and a distinction between a material and a formal aspect of the pontiff. That's why I brought up the Dominican traditional in this. Where does Pius the 12th use the term legitimate racism? I can't remember where he talks. It's from an allocution. Francis said that popes did ill in the past for using the death penalty, specifically in the papal states. I'm confused. Do you think that it's somehow impossible for the popes to have done ill in their exercise of like temporal jurisdiction over the papal states? I mean, like, I think that I should tend towards defending their actions, but like in the temporal exercise of the papal states, the popes did a lot of things which are wrong. I'm not saying the death penalty was one of them, but I'm also saying that this does not necessarily mean what you're saying about Pope Francis. Why do you pronounce dignitatis? What's wrong with dignitatis? Okay, I don't know. Okay, so what do you make of the teaching of Benedict XVI in Ecclesia Medio Oriente number 26 and the right to religious freedom? Well, I haven't read that particular text until now, and I think it would be irresponsible for me to comment on it right now. But yeah. Have I read Vermeule's Common Good Constitutionalism worth the read? No, I haven't. Okay. No, in the sense that they employed it. It was an address he gave. Let me find it. I mean, I will concede, and I'm not at all arguing with you that I think that he said probably some pretty not good things. I was going to say pretty cold things, but I think it's probably irreverent for me to say cold. Pretty not good things about the death penalty in various different addresses and letters and sermons, and etc. I'm just saying when it comes to like what entered into his magisterium, like as to his doctrinal pronouncements, he was much more reserved and precise in what he said. Like that's the only claim that I'm making. John Paul I taught extra Ecclesiam Nullisalis. Did he have a specific address on this? Okay, you have to tell me whether you're trolling me or not. I'm gonna leave after this. I'm in live a little bit longer than normal. Bro, you have to tell me. Yeah, I've actually read a little. You know what's crazy is one of the things that it's like a papal tradition. It was like divine providence that this had to happen. One of the teachings of is he blessed? I think he's blessed. Blessed John Paul I. One of the teachings of Blessed John Paul I while he was on earth was against Israel. He was calling out Israel for attacking Lebanon because this was during like one of the invasions of Lebanon by Israel. So he was trolling Israel while he was Pope. So by divine providence, this has been retained in the papal magisterium of Blessed John Paul I. It was kind of awesome. Oh yeah. Well, you would agree that the use of the death penalty is per se contrary to the gospel. That's how he framed it. Oh no. I'm saying, is that one of the problematic statements? Yeah, that is problematic. It's problematic to say the death penalty is per se contrary to the gospel. Have you seen Michael Lofton's? I refuse to cope about this one. I refuse to cope about this one. Have you seen Michael Lofton's Sorry, have you seen like Michael Lofton's cope about it? He says it's he like reads it and he like emphasizes. Somebody give me the clip. Somebody get the clip on this one. It's like really funny. He's like per se contrary in this situation, and like Lofton thought that he just like absolutely cooked on this one. That it was per se contrary in this situation, or like per se contrary in this circumstance. And it's like, dude, come on, that's like the opposite of what per se means. Are you kidding me? Um, but anyways, but yeah, that's one of like the pretty bad statements. Have I read that book? No, I have not. I'm still trying to wait for the John Paul the blessed John Paul the First quote. Is that how you guys are keeping me so long? You're looking. Oh my goodness. Okay, I will use my Vatican VA study skills right now, and I will try to find it before you do. Okay, so blessed John Paul the First, which is like I almost know nothing about blessed John Paul the First. Okay. I keep thinking about I've been reading a lot of Benedict the 16th, and I keep thinking about if Benedict the 16th had not resigned, how different the church would be today. It's weird. Okay, so nope, nothing for outside the church. I'm gonna try to look for necessary for salvation. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, I can't. Cannot find anything. I think you made that up. The John Paul the First quote where he said that God is more mother than father, though. Um, I've never heard this before. That's really weird. There's specific directives from the church on the male use of pronouns when it comes to God. Funnily enough, and this is one of them where it talks about the fatherhood of God. Like it's technically like there are certain places in scripture where God is described as mother. Like there's nothing technically wrong with that because obviously, gender is something which is of the body, not of the soul, much less of God, who is a pure spirit. But it's just that's not a huge fan of saying that. Can we get a video on the death penalty? No. Hassan can tell you about the death penalty. Hassan does all that stuff. I don't do death penalty stuff. I think I like the. By the way, let me look. Yes, it is analogous language, but it's formal and proper. It's not metaphorical. So there's a difference between something being analogous, which is everything we say about God, and something being metaphorical. Something which is analogous can be proper. Something which is metaphorical is not proper. Are canonizations infallible? Yes, they are infallible. Okay. I'm still waiting for this John Paul the First quote. I will wait here all the time. So true. It is not Saint John the 23rd. It is not possible to be united to Jesus Christ except in the church and through the church. The Leo the 14th actually said something very similar to this, where he said it's not possible to attain true unity except under the Roman Pontiff, which was awesome. Oh my goodness. I'm about to crash out if you cannot find me that quote from John Paul I on Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus. But actually, okay, Hassan. Hassan's here. I'm gonna die. Okay, what are you saying, Hassan? Can you read his Israel quote? Yeah. Let me bring it up. Actually, I should read all of Blessed John Paul I's Israel quote. Israel Yeah, so this is his general audience on Wednesday, September 6th, 1978. Okay. I don't want to read this whole thing. Basically, you have learned from the press, from television, that today at Camp David, an important meeting begins between the rulers of Egypt, Israel, and the United States in the hope of finding a solution to the conflict in the Middle East. This conflict, which for more than 30 years has been continued on the land of Jesus, has already caused so many victims, so much suffering, both among the Arabs and the Israelis. Like an evil malady, it has infected the neighboring countries. Think of the Lebanon, a martyred Lebanon, upset by the repercussions of the crisis. For this, then, I shall like to pray together with you for the success of the Camp David meeting, that these talks may pave the way to a full and just peace. Just, that is, the satisfaction of all parties in the conflict, full, leaving any problem unresolved, the problem of the people of Palestine, the security of Israel, the holy city of Jerusalem. Let us ask the Lord to enlighten those responsible for all the people concerned, so that they may be far-seeing and courageous in taking the decisions that should bring serenity and peace to the Holy Land, to the whole world of the East. Look at the chat, Wagner. Did you find it? Radio message. Okay. Yeah, Mossad killed him. John, the answer is no comment. Okay, this is radio message, 22nd of August, 1978. Crap, where is his radio? Oh, messages right here. Oh, this is his 27th of August. That's his Urbi et Orbi blessing. So this was his radio message. Oh my gosh, this is so long. Where is this? Can you give me the specific? Dude, this is such coal. You're not going to tell me the exact place where it is? Only in the one in the church. Okay, here it is. Oh, dude, this is awesome. Oh man, dude, this is such an awesome quote. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. So, according to the words of St. Augustine, an image dear to the ancient fathers of the church, the ship of the church must not fear, because it is guided by Christ and by his vicar. Although the ship is tossed about, it is still a ship. It carries the disciples and it receives Christ. Yes, it is tossed on the sea, but without it, one would immediately perish. End quote. Only in the church is salvation. Without it, one perishes. Exclamation point. So true. That was awesome. The uniqueness of the Catholic Church. Okay, anyways, now I need to go. Luigi's gonna screenshot that. I didn't bring up the I didn't bring up the message. Okay, bye. Hope you all have a wonderful day. God bless.